Hello, everyone. I hope you've all been keeping well, safe, and healthy. It's great to see so many of you joining us for today's webinar, A Quick Fix or Essential for Longevity, Intermittent Fasting with Dr. Nikita Grover and Dr. Ursula Levine. Whether it's 5-2, 16-8, alternate days, fasting has become a popular approach to managing health. The last few months have wreaked havoc with routine, and for many of us, this has affected our eating habits. As we reacclimatize and prioritize managing weight, improving energy and focus, we will look at the ways in which fasting can play in optimizing our health and nutrition. Member of the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of GPs, a leading general practitioner and certified functional medicine practitioner, Dr. Nikita Grover joins us from Lanserhof at the Arts Club for an insightful look at the impact of fasting. From reducing the risk of degenerative diseases to enhancing brain function, we'll explore fasting's far-reaching nutrition and lifestyle benefits. In conversation with Dr. Grover will be general practitioner from Lanserhof at the Arts Club, Dr. Ursula Levine, who will also bring her 30 years of clinical experience to the discussion. If anyone has any questions over the course of the talk, please do type them into the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Levine will then field as many of those questions as possible towards the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I shall hand you over to Dr. Grover and to Dr. Levine. Nikita and Ursula, over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, hi everybody, welcome to our talk. And I have to say, I'm really pleased and privileged to say that I know Dr. Grover both as a colleague and as a dear friend. We studied Maya medicine together and are, as far as we know, currently amongst the few practicing Maya doctors in the UK. But Dr. Grover is not only a qualified Maya doctor, as Charlie said, but also a practicing GP, and she works in her London practice as well as at Lanserhof at the Arts Club. Dr. Grover is a compassionate, caring and dedicated practitioner whose objective is to provide patients with treatments that best meet their individual needs. And in this podcast, Dr. Grover is going to offer you insight into a subject that a lot of us are particularly interested at the moment, fasting. And I'm really looking forward to hearing her views and professional opinions on this critical topic. Obviously, I'm going to put in some questions of my own and hopefully extract some of this intuitive understanding Dr. Grover has for the subject. When Dr. Grover finishes, as Charlie says, we will have ample opportunity to ask questions. And so let's just open the subject of fasting. And let me dive into my first question. Dr. Grover, losing weight seems to be everyone's lips at the moment. Could you explain how and why fasting could be helpful at this moment?
Thank you both for those lovely introductions, and a very warm introduction from both of you. And thank you, Ursula, too, for yours. And I'm really delighted to be here with all of you this evening and hope to give you an understanding and an overview of the impact fasting that can have both on weight and longevity, and how we at Lanserhof can support you through that. And Ursula, I'm going to hope to answer your questions through a few slides, if that's okay. And it may not be quite in the order that you asked the questions, but hopefully it will answer them. So we're currently in a health space that's full of conversations about weight gain and obesity post-COVID, as you rightly say. And the social media platforms are absolutely buzzing with these conversations. And we know that there is a link between obesity and immunity. Obese patients are amongst those with the highest risks of getting COVID, along with the elderly, male gender, and those of Black and ethnic minority groups. And we all know that because of the link between obesity and immunity, we kind of feel that we're in this sandwich between the peak of COVID that we've just had and the next peak that we know is coming, and we feel that we want to get slimmer to reduce those risks before that second wave comes. And it is a big problem. There is a waistline crisis going on in the UK. A third of the UK is obese, and another third, or just over a third, is overweight. And quite frankly, this is a waistline crisis that we need to deal with. And even Boris Johnson is launching an obesity campaign and calling for fast action, although I would have preferred it if he called it fasting action. But there we go, we'll get around to it in the end. But what's interesting is that our tummies are not the same. And if you look at the gentleman who's looking at a vision of his former self, he had, good muscle development, a very tight waist, tight abdomen, and he spent 3 months in lockdown, and his muscles aren't that well developed, and he's got this rather rotund belly. And this is what we call the lockdown belly. Previously, before lockdown, we used to call it tofu, thin on the outside and fat on the inside. And the characteristic thing about this belly is that the fat that is stored in this belly is on the inside of the abdomen. Let's contrast that with the sumo wrestler. So the sumo wrestler, big guy, lots of muscle, but also lots of fat. Anyone would think that he was clinically obese, but actually his fat is very different. And his fat is subcutaneous fat. It's in the skin. And the reason that's important is the way we distribute our fat in our bodies determines our health risks. So people who are overweight and have fat outside the belly are not in the same category of health risks as those that have it inside the belly. So why does that matter? Well, it turns out that this visceral fat, we call it visceral fat, the internal body fat, is related. We know it's related to poor immunity, but this visceral fat doesn't behave in a nice, quiet sort of storage way. It wraps around the body and the internal organs and infiltrates the liver and the pancreas and the heart and the spleen, and it behaves like a chemical factory. It secretes hormones that disrupt our appetite signals, so it makes us want to eat more, it makes us gain more weight. And it also produces toxic chemicals that can cause long-term harm by causing inflammation to our organs and blood vessels and lead to diabetes, heart disease, and even cancers. And of course, this is also what leads to how it affects our immunity. And it does this by causing inflammation. Now, most of us understand inflammation to be what happens when we cut our finger. If you've got a paper cut or you've sliced it with a knife or something, it gets
I'll check that on the way home. I'll see if it's open.
It gets hot, it gets tender, it gets swollen, and it doesn't work quite so well. But the sort of inflammation that these toxic chemicals and the visceral fat cause are a kind of slow burn. And this slow burn is really, really insidious. It's quiet, and it causes our immune system to behave in a very, very disrupted way, and can cause our reactions to the COVID virus to be out of proportion. And that's one of the reasons why people who are obese and have this visceral fat tend to have such a poor outcome with COVID infection. The other thing about this slow burn of inflammation is that it contributes to our aging. And we give it a term now, we call it inflammaging. So a lot of people ask me, well, does that mean if I've got this visceral fat and this lockdown belly, do I need to eat less fat? And people are actually confused about what to eat. And, understandably so, after 40 years of indoctrination about low-fat diets and those increased hidden sugars, we've seen a massive rise in obesity and chronic disease, which is, unheard of. The Western world is rife with it. But we know that our Japanese friend, the sumo wrestler, and the Eskimos, who have very high fat diets and eat lots of blubber, they don't have the same health risks. They've got very low risks of diabetes and heart disease. So I just wanted to show you a little graph here, and I hope it's not too sciencey, but I want you to understand that when we eat a meal that contains carbohydrates, it's basically broken down into glucose molecules. Carbohydrates, starches, and by that I mean things like a bowl of rice or a bowl of pasta or food that contains those things, it's basically like a chain of glucose molecules that are holding hands. And in order to get that food into our bodies, it has to undergo digestion. And what digestion does is break those glucose molecules up. It breaks those chains and releases that glucose into the bloodstream. And we can see here what happens when that glucose is released into the bloodstream. It causes a rise in the blood glucose. Now, foods that pass into the bloodstream quickly, like fruit juice, simple table sugar, or white bread, pasta, that kind of thing, will cause a very high rise in the glucose and a very quick rise in the glucose. And the way the body responds to that is by secreting the hormone insulin to get that glucose into cells. The body maintains its glucose levels through a very, very specific range, and it doesn't like to have the blood glucose too high. Otherwise, what would happen is we would all get diabetes after every meal that we ate. So we have to keep that blood glucose in absolute check. And what happens is that if we eat a lot of sugary foods or foods that contain starches, that sometimes the insulin is secreted, it sort of overshoots the mark, and we secrete much more insulin than we actually need. And then we end up with this glucose crash where we just feel hungry and hangry, and we could eat our own arm because too much insulin has been secreted. The body hasn't quite got it right. And then the follow-on from that is that we end up eating more of the foods that are causing the problem. Now, that's a physiological response, and that's what happens. But the more sugary foods we eat, the glucose goes into the cells, but sometimes the requirement, sometimes what the glucose that we have is surplus to what the cells can cope with. And everything that's surplus to requirements ends up being stored as fat. So insulin makes the excess glucose get stored as fat. And you can see at the end here that excess glucose causes high insulin. Some of it's used as cellular energy, and the rest gets stored as fat. So what happens, this graphic just shows us what happens when we eat a high carb diet. It goes through the digestion and into the bloodstream. The insulin gets secreted by the pancreas, and we store the excess as body fat. But what happens when we fast is that no food is going in, and the body then drops the amount of insulin that it produces. And as the insulin level comes down, the body begins to burn body fat. This is called the metabolic switch. So the body starts using the body fat as fuel, having previously used the glucose.
Wow. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. And many patients often wonder how they're going to feel when they begin to fast. And so I thought it might be useful just to show what happens during each day of a fast and how people feel. So at the beginning, they're using up the rest of the glucose that's in their body, and the insulin has been secreted, and it's beginning to get lower, and they're beginning to feel the effects of not having glucose in their bodies, and they really hit the wall. They start feeling lightheaded, dizzy, headachy, hungry and hangry. And then by the second day, the body starts using different sources of energy, fuel, to produce glucose, and it actually uses some of the protein that happens to be in our collagen or in our muscles. There's still a little bit of glucose left, and it begins to use the fuel that was stored in the fat and begin to break it down, because there isn't any insulin around that is stopping that process from happening. And so around day 2, people might feel a bit weak, still a bit fuzzy in the head, a little bit hungry, perhaps a little bit cold. By day 3, we're still using a little bit of protein, and the fat burning is happening much more efficiently. We're still feeling a bit slow and a bit low in energy, but surprisingly, hunger drops. We're still feeling a little bit cold. And then day 4 and onwards is usually when the fat burning is really happening at a good rate. And we begin to completely lose our hunger, and we begin to find that we've got more energy. And rightly so, because that excess energy was stored there for a rainy day for us to use when we needed it. And that's exactly what the body's doing. We're fasting, the insulin levels are low, the key to open up the body fat stores is open, and we begin to burn that body fat. But something else happens, which is quite magical. There is a sweet spot. The sweet spot happens at around day 3 or 4, and it's called autophagy. Some of you may have heard of autophagy. Autophagy literally means self-eating. And what happens is that the body starts a sort of spring cleaning process. Any of the kind of dead old cells that really shouldn't be there and aren't functioning very well get kicked out. And those cells that perhaps have got some useful parts in that we could recycle, get recycled, and they get used to make new cells. And this really rejuvenates and revitalizes the body. And these new cells lie in store, these new cleaned up cells lie in store, so that when we start refeeding again, we can build very healthy tissue and get back to where we need it to be.
That sounded very, very interesting, and I really like how you explained the days. And it sounds interesting to have a sweet spot without sugar, right? Sounds like a contradiction.
Should have used a different word.
No, it's quite good, yeah. So I still remember when we all counted calories, yeah, and that seems to be so outdated. So can you explain how fasting differs from a calorie counting diet, and what are the benefits of that?
Sure. So we say it's outdated, but you'll be surprised. There are so many patients I see that still think that it's about cutting calories, and they're not thinking about when they're eating. They're thinking about just reducing a little bit of their total intake on a daily basis. And what happens when they do that is they're eating whenever they want, but their metabolic rate, the rate at which they burn calories, actually slows down. So they very quickly regain weight after an initial weight loss when they start eating normally again after their calorie controlled diet. Fasting is very different, and I think we kind of have to ask ourselves, what constitutes a fast? Why is it different? And again, if we think about the insulin, it's about keeping the insulin as low as we possibly can. And really, in order to do that, you need to not be eating for a minimum of 12 hours. So an overnight fast, for example, would qualify for that. And the calories may or may not be reduced during that time. You might be eating the same calories in the other 12 hours, or you may decide that you're eating less calories in the rest of the 12 hours. But the fact that you've had that 12-hour break without food, with lower insulin levels, does constitute a fast. And the other important thing is that it should be repeated at regular intervals so that we can maintain the metabolic rate. And in fact, there are lots of studies showing that you're absolutely right. The calorie controlled diets are outdated. They just result in yo-yo diets, and people just put on more weight than they had in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important to get across. But people often feel that it's beyond their reach to fast, and although fasting can be challenging, we have to realize that humans have evolved to fast over millions of years. Fasting is the most natural process. In the distant past, when food was often scarce and we were dependent on the hunt and the harvest and dependent on the seasons, with plenty of food in the summer and not much in the winter, our winter hunger was punctuated by these bursts of intermittent eating. And so we had cycles of eating and fasting. It was kind of like HIIT training for food. It's interval training, essentially, but over a different time frame. And these very strong evolutionary pressures forced our bodies to adapt. And over the years, our genes changed to allow us to adapt to the feast and famine, and allowed us to survive during these periods of stress and hunger. So continuous feeding, this kind of all time chronic summer, isn't really provided for in evolution. The fasting periods are really important for challenging the body. And in fact, it was those people that were very good at storing fat when food was plenty, but and then able to release that fat very efficiently when food was scarce, that had these thrifty genes, which were very, very useful. But the problem is, in today's environments, when we're in chronic summer and we have this food all the time, is that there is this tendency to just keep piling on the fat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think because of this, we have to really realise that there is an innate fasting instinct. If we look at different cultures and communities, people fast at Ramadan, or during Lent, or Yom Kippur, or the Hindus fast, the Buddhists fast. Fasting is so much part of lots and lots of cultures, and I think the fear that sometimes that we have about fasting is in part due to this disconnect from the lineages of wisdom that we have, because so many of us are displaced from our communities because of globalization and things like that. So I think we've got to realize that we need to connect back with our genes and our communities in order to be able to tap into this magic that they had that will help us lose weight. And an example of that, again, is the blue zones. I don't know whether any of you recall the blue zones. I mean, they were documented amazingly well by Dan Buettner in his piece for National Geographic. And the blue zones are the areas of the world, I think he identified about 5, with the greatest number of centenarians. And guess what? Centenarians fast. These people in the blue zones fast. And this is one of the reasons that they're so fit and well, and they live so long. And they are part of these communities. They live as communities which observe the same traditions around food and fasting practices. And I think that's a really important thing. Again, if we look, these are the blue zones, but fasting isn't just giving us benefits in terms of reducing weight. It prevents the long-term illnesses and chronic diseases, and it's often referred. We often have a distinction between health span and lifespan, and actually, what we want to do is to be able to lead disease-free lives, where we live a long life, but we are as healthy as possible, as active as possible, and integrating with our families and friends from a position of health for as long as we possibly can do. So not eating and allowing our bodies to rest for more than 12 hours begins the process of regeneration and detoxification, with a resulting plethora of benefits and many clinical studies both on humans and mammals are now coming through confirming these benefits, although we still do need a bit more research. And just to talk about the benefits that you mentioned, so obviously weight loss, but weight loss that is without hunger and without cravings, because we are getting food, we're tapping the resources of our fat stores, and there's plenty of energy in those fat stores. And because we're triggering, if we allow it, the process of autophagy, guess what? Part of the proteins that get eaten up and used as part of autophagy are in the collagen of our skin. So when we fast, we lose weight and we have less saggy skin. I mean, who doesn't want less saggy skin? We reduce chronic diseases, diabetes and obesity. And the gut microbiome improves as well, the trillions of bacteria that live in our guts, and the digestion improves massively. So does sleep, and the processes of detoxification, the cleaning up of the liver, all these toxins that are released from the fat are really cleared up by the liver. And because autophagy begins to clear up the debris of the cells in the brain, notice that we have less brain fog, and our mood is better and our cognition is better. And the debris that's in our mitochondria, those little organelles in our cells that are the batteries that give us energy, they work much more efficiently as well. So our whole body is working much better and much more efficiently, our immune system too, and this is what contributes to better health, better longevity, and rejuvenation from the inside out. And this has even been witnessed by looking at the telomeres, those little nagels at the end of our chromosomes that can tell us how old we are. They actually lengthen with fasting. And of course, there's the other benefits, the empowerment that comes with the control of taking back control of something that you feel is controlling you. And there's lots of spiritual benefits in that too.
It seems that the benefits of fasting really encompasses all our levels of health, the mental, the physical, the emotional, as you said, the spiritual, when your brain fog goes away. So this has an overall benefit. And could you just talk us through the different methods? So how do we do it? The different methods of therapeutic fasting, and especially when we think of, as Lanserhof at the Arts Club is a walk-in clinic. Yeah, so we are a non-residential facility. So how can we do that?
Absolutely. So I think sometimes all of these different methods of fasting can be really confusing. Some of them include food, some of them don't include food, and people get a little bit confused by all of that. And it doesn't have to be eating nothing. It's more about the gaps between meals and about getting that insulin level down. We've all heard of all of these different methods, but I'll just go over them again. So there's the 12-12, which is basically an overnight fast. So you might have your last meal at 7 p.m. and then have your breakfast at 7 p.m. the next day. And that can then be extended to 16-8. So you might have your last meal at 7 p.m. and then have your breakfast at 11, and that gives a longer fast. Or you might decide that you just want to have one meal a day, which is effectively a 23-1, but you might, for example, have your dinner at 7 p.m. and then go to bed, have your overnight fast, go to work in the morning without breakfast, busy all day, don't really bother about eating anything, but then when you come home, you can have your meal with your family. So it doesn't really feel as though you're fasting, but you've given yourself nearly 24 hours of a food-free period and lower insulin levels. We then move to fasting within a week. So you could fast on alternate days, so every other day is a fast, or you could fast for 2 of the days out of the week, and they're not normally in sequence, and that's the 5-2 diet. And there's also something called a fasting mimicking diet, which is, I'll go into a little bit later with another slide, but also there are prolonged diets. We can actually fast without food for 3, 5, or 7 days. But I don't ever advise not having water when we're fasting. I don't advise dry fasts. When we're fasting therapeutically, water should be included. So if we just go to the first, so the first sort was the time-restricted feeding, which is the restriction of eating within a 24-hour period. So we reduce the eating window, not the amount. As I said, it's a minimum 12 hours. And there is evidence, again, that it has been shown to have beneficial effects on health, disease, and aging, and reduction in obesity and cancer, even with a 16-8 or a 1 meal a day diet. So this really does have benefits to your health. If we move on to the 5-2 or alternate day, this was publicised by Michael Mosley. He's done the fast diet and the fast 800 diet. And this really is either a complete fast or a modified fast. So on your fasting days, you can have 500 or even up to 800 calories, which would work out as 2 small meals per week. But it is important, I think, to say that you should be eating healthily, a healthy diet on your non-fasting days as well. But there isn't really calorie restriction on those non-fasting days. But you need to be eating real food, eggs, soups, hummus, good fats, avocado, olive oil. And I think the key is about how you mix them, how you introduce herbs and spices and make things really tasty so that you don't really feel that you're missing out. The fasting mimicking diet is an interesting one. So this was introduced by Walter Longo. Many of you may have read The Longevity Diet. And Walter Longo is a physician that works in the Institute of Gerontology at the University of Southern California. And he worked out a diet that mimics fasting. It's a pre-packaged diet that includes plant-based foods, mainly fats, oils, nuts, and a plant-based protein. And it tricks the body into feeling that it's been fed, but on a cellular level, the cells think that the body is fasting. And so you get all the benefits of fasting without fasting. It's amazing. And evidence shows that it's safe, reduces chronic disease, and aging risk markers. And again, it's something that needs to be cycled. So people will do it for 5 days in a month, and then they might repeat it every 3 months, so maybe 4 times a year. And it's quite, it's quite a modest diet. Most people can manage it very successfully and do notice the benefits at the end of it. And in fact, they publicise the benefits over the course of the 5-day period. So in day 1, the fasting state begins to be primed, then you move into fat burning, then the autophagy starts happening, then the cells begin to regenerate, and then that process continues. So just to repeat again, it's about the fasting, the autophagy, and stem cell regeneration. And then there's prolonged fasting. Ursula, you and I have both been on prolonged fasts, and I have to say, having never really fasted before, probably about 4 years ago, and finding myself having been recommended by a friend to go to Lanserhof, completely oblivious to the benefits, it completely transformed my life. And I started getting involved in nutrition and functional medicine and all of these sorts of things. And I really think that the vitality, the strength, the energy, the lack of brain fog that you can get from doing a prolonged fast can be fantastic. But don't think that you have to dive into this right from the beginning. This has to be taken very gently. If you don't have the energy to do it, we start where you are. If that just means doing an overnight fast, then that's what we start with. If you can then extend it to 16 hours in the day, then we do that. Then we move on to 5-2. It can be done progressively, or you can dive in at the deep end. It all depends on literally what you have the stomach for, and your health, what your health is to start with, and whether your body can actually cope with the different stresses that the fasting can have. The other thing just to say is that there is a category of, there is a sequence of benefits. There's a sort of sliding scale of benefits, if you like. So, if you're doing a complete prolonged fast, the benefits are going to be achieved quicker and perhaps in a more lasting way than if you're just doing a little bit as you go along, but you will have benefits all the way along.
Yeah, you just mentioned our hero, Dr. Meyer, where we did our training. So what it boils down to, that there is no one size fits all, as I understand it, right? And so could you go a little bit into depth, which factors might affect the patient's response to fasting, and how might they be addressed by a consultation, for instance?
Absolutely, you're completely right. There are so many fasting options, and again, people aren't quite sure which one's right for them, and the complexity is enormous and immense, and these are just some of the factors that determine our weight and our fasting responses. And we have to realize that fasting doesn't operate in a silo. Everything is connected with everything else, and we have a lot of scientific knowledge and evidence about what these connections are now and how to evaluate them. We know that things start with our genetics. Some of us have a tendency to put on a bit more weight. We have a predisposition, or we hold certain genes, but that doesn't mean that we can't lose weight. It means that actually the other factors can help us move up and down the scale of our predisposition. We know that if we've got nutritional deficiencies, for example, and the typical ones are things like vitamin D, magnesium, B vitamins, iron. When we have those nutrient deficiencies, we can't lose weight so well. It predisposes to inflammation and poor immune function, which then stops us losing the weight that we want to lose, and perhaps reduces the benefit that we might get from the fasting. We know that if our gut is leaky, that the permeability of the gut membrane is allowing too many particles, undigested particles through, that also sets up inflammation and poor immune function, and that can disturb all sorts of things like our hormones and our circadian rhythms, and so too the gut microbiome. All those trillions of bacteria that live in our gut perhaps play the biggest role in determining our weight and our fasting responses. And we can do tests on the gut microbiome. We can find out who the critters are that are living in there, and we can also identify what they're doing in there. They're producing metabolites, they're producing nutrients, they're producing hormones, and all of those things can either aid us in our fasting responses, or they can hinder it. We also know that exercise is really important, and exercise can really enhance our fasting responses, and a particular sort of exercise. So strength exercise is really helpful. We also know that our hormones and our can affect our stress responses and social connections as well. So it's a really, really complex story. And I just wanted to give the example of these two twins. So clearly they share 100% of their genes. They're genetically identical, but in this case, only their gut microbiome was different, and in fact, they only share 37% of similar gut bacteria, if you compare that to about 35% of the normal population. So, one is slim and the other one is carrying that excess weight because of her gut microbiome. So we respond differently to foods because of these sorts of things. And it's really important that we identify those factors. And at Lanserhof, we can take a really deep dive into your unique characteristics and really try and personalize a plan for you, and look at all those parameters. So the way we do it is through a team approach, and it is very personalised. And the number one priority for us is your safety. And we also want to be sure that we're doing everything as precisely as possible based on scientific tests, and also help your motivation with support. So at the very beginning, we take a very, very detailed medical consultation. And that can take 60 to 90 minutes. Your story is very key to giving us the clues of what we need to look for in those tests. And when we take a functional approach, we're really looking at the root causes in the whole system. There are certain patients that shouldn't fast, so women that are pregnant and breastfeeding, people that are underweight or who have eating disorders or psychiatric illnesses. Really, I think it's best to avoid fasting. People with type 1 diabetes or acute illnesses should avoid fasting. The precision is another really key factor, and there's nothing more precise than the 6-minute MRI. Seeing that image of your fat shining white all over your body is just enough to make anyone decide to do something about their weight and go on a diet. But then to see it disappear is just the most fantastic thing, and that really enhances motivation. We do some specific blood tests, really looking at all of those parameters that I showed you in that Damien Hirst-esque slide. So we're looking for nutrients, we're looking for evidence of inflammation, we're looking at your hormone levels, and we also want to do a microbiome test to look at those organisms that are living in the gut. We also do some genetic tests to see what your predispositions are, so that we know how we can manipulate them and where you might have been struggling or plateauing with your weight, so that we can really emphasize the treatments and make the most of your fasting regime. And we understand that fasting really can be difficult at the beginning, and it's really important that you get feedback from what's going on, that you understand what the tests are doing and what the results mean, and see the improvements as they go on. That really enhances your motivation. And we're here to support you in a very multidisciplinary way. And that includes the strength exercises. We've got a fantastic gym, fantastic physios and a gym team. We look at your nutrition, both during fasting and on non-fasting days, and can set up a brilliant program for you. And we can also look at those nutrient deficiencies and give you very, very precise supplements. Nobody likes to take supplements unnecessarily, but we can do it in a targeted way. And we can also look at enhancing your fasting experience through cold therapy and through exerting oxidative stress. There are certain genes that really love cold therapy, cold water swimming, cryogenic chambers. They really respond to those cold stresses. And a little oxidative stress can make a difference too. And really what we're looking to do is to try and build an incentive for you to build this as part of your lifestyle. And that's what really gets you into those blue zones. So just in summary, robust metabolic cycles of feeding and fasting can protect us against the nutritional challenges that predispose us to obesity. And we know that fasting gives you more than just weight loss. If we can address and target serious aging associated diseases with precision, the side effect will be longevity. And I think it's really important that we take back control and that we empower ourselves over our weight and our diets. And I think fasting is the way to do it. Thank you. Come to our blue zone.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And, you know, in the context of what you said about the cold, right? I always quote you in my talks when you showed us the Wim Hof dance.
Ah, yes.
Yes, one body part in the cold shower and the next body part, because water trading is not so well known in the English-speaking countries.
Absolutely. So I don't know whether our audience, you know, our lovely audience is aware of Wim Hof, but look him up if you're not. He's also known as the Iceman, and he shows some brilliant videos about how you can begin to introduce yourself to a bit of cold water when you're in the shower, if the whole idea appalls you. And it's exactly as you say, yes, you know, it's just by putting little bits of your body parts in to begin with, and then if you can, just let that cold shower just go all over you, and you will be amazed by how much energy it creates. And on a scientific basis, you know, there are specific genes that we can actually look at that respond to cold water by boosting your the organelles that produce energy. So there's a direct response on your genes of that cold water on building energy. So it's scientifically proven. It really does do something.
So there is a lot in our approach that affects everybody, and a lot that affects people specifically. So as I said before, there is no one size fits all, and we create bespoke programs. Mm-hmm. So we have a question out there. If you were a beginner to fasting, how would you recommend the right steps to start?
Okay, well, I think that if you are fit and well and have no medical conditions, then it is something that you can do at home. And I would say that you would start by maybe doing an overnight fast. So making sure that you're having no food between your evening meal at 7 p.m. and your breakfast. If you're already doing that, then you might extend that window to the 16-8. And if you're already doing that, you might want to think about doing one meal a day. So I would progress through the stages of fasting that we alluded to earlier. So start with time-restricted feeding to begin with, and then go into perhaps a 5-2, where you're fasting 2 days of the week with food, but reduced calories on those fasting days.
Right.
The key thing is to make sure that you're leaving that long window that keeps your insulin levels down.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question here. Following a regime of intermittent fasting, 1 week to 1 month, what do you specifically look for as markers in blood tests to gauge the efficacy of the regime? In particular, how important is the measure of HbA1c?
Yeah, so that's really important. We'd look at HbA1c, we'd look at your C-reactive protein, we'd look at your blood fat, so your cholesterol markers, your HDL and your triglycerides. We know that triglycerides go up when people are carrying a lot of excess weight because of increased calories from carbohydrates. And I think those are probably the key ones that I can think of at the moment. But we'd also look at nutrients as well, I think, just to see how those have changed over, over your fasting period.
Yeah, and when we think of one of the pillars in modern Maya medicine is the supplementation, right? Yeah. So we look at which deficiencies we detect, and then we can supplement accordingly, orally or with IV treatments, even if it's necessary, right?
Yeah,
it's much more intense. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's important to know that we really can do the test to look at those nutrients. So it's not just being done blind. It really is on the basis of proper information.
Yeah, and we have another question here regarding another pillar in Maya medicine regarding exercise, right? Mm-hmm. So routine exercise, how much would we recommend? I mean, I think when you come in as a marathon trainee, yeah, you would probably have a different sports regime than if somebody who doesn't lift his arms every day, yeah.
Absolutely. I think the key thing is that it all depends on you. It all depends on the individual patient. And I think that, again, it's the same thing. We're not all medium. And I think this is where conventional medicine perhaps lets us down, is that we're trying to be, square blocks, trying to fit into these round holes, and we don't. I think it's really important to create a bespoke plan for us as individuals, so that we know where you start, how much exercise you need to be doing, what sort of exercise you need to be doing. Does it need to be strength exercise? Does it need to be about flexibility? Does it need to be about coordination? Does it need to be about aerobic exercise? There are so many different elements of exercise that are important, but where we start depends on that individual. I can't stress how important, your stories are. We need to hear your stories, and we need to know where you're at before we can help.
Yeah, I have a question here about from somebody who stuck to a 16-hour intermittent fasting regime during lockdown, but nothing seems to move. And I think what you just said feeds into that so many other aspects need to be taken into account. The fasting is like an overall thing, but the diagnostics before, and since we're doctors, right, before we treat, there is always a diagnosis.
Yes.
So we need to have all the whole picture, right?
Yeah. No, completely right. And I really sympathise with how frustrating it can be when you feel that you're doing it right and it's not working, or we hit those plateaus. But there are so many inroads. I showed you that slide of how complex it really is, and it really is. And sometimes just a tweak in the amount of activity that you're doing, or just a tweak with a little bit more magnesium, or actually picking up that your thyroid hormone is slightly underactive, can suddenly accelerate your progress no end. So our bodies, as I said before, they don't operate in silos. Everything is connected, and if you find that you're hitting a plateau, come and see us, because there's something that we can find that will probably just help you move that hurdle.
So we have another question. How often should you fast? Can it be done every day for life?
Well, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think that's a healthy way of doing it. It's not what evolution has planned us to do. Our genes want us to go through feast and famine. They want us to fast, and they want us to then eat normally. We're not programmed for constant eating, and we're not programmed for constant fasting. And I think that, we have to realise that it's the cycles that are important. Ursula, you're nodding, so I think you agree with me in that. We've got to realise constant fasting and is really not provided for. So I think that would be unhealthy.
Yeah, I think you said a very important thing. It's the cycle. I mean, all our human lives go in cycle. And if you take it simple, I mean, in the German-speaking countries, you very often go on a fast twice a year with the changing season. So obviously spring, where everything changes, you go more out, you want to show your body, you move more, then this is a good time for fasting, because it's in our human cycle. It's a time for change. And some people want to enhance that, and I especially suggest that, especially when people have seasonal allergies in spring, to prepare their whole nutrition over winter and not just let everything lag. So spring and autumn is something that is very common in the German-speaking countries to fast.
And I think over time, we've lost that cycling in so many different, areas of our life. And I think, that really is the secret. Our secret weapon is understanding that there are cycles, and that we do need to go through those things. And I think what you say about, fasting in the autumn and the spring is excellent. Yeah.
So we have very many questions. So I tried to pick. let's talk about caffeine, yeah, because as you remember me on our fasting when I went off caffeine, and it was, I had really had a very bad detox reaction. So what do you suggest?
No, that's a really good question, and I think that it's a difficult one, but I think that again it depends. It's very difficult to give a blanket answer, but there's definitely some people who, when they have caffeine and they abruptly stop it, that they will get symptoms from the caffeine withdrawal. And sometimes that can completely disrupt the fasting progress. It overtakes. And in some cases, people will either have to carry on their coffee, or there can be a chicory coffee supplement, which can actually make people feel that they're getting the benefits of the coffee without actually taking it. I think generally I would be saying it's best to avoid the caffeine if you can during a fast, because it is a stimulant and it does affect your sleep. And it's often only when people stop caffeine completely and they can actually return to their normal sleep-wake cycles. And I think that, you know, if you're doing a residential fast, for example, coming off the caffeine is important. You need to know that you can do without it, sleep without it, and lead a normal life without it. But I think, again, we have to weigh it up. And we can actually test for the caffeine genes. So, you know, we can see where on the scale you are. It doesn't give us, it doesn't mean that can't be adjusted or manipulated, but at least it tells us what your predisposition is.
Yeah.
Sorry not to give you a straight answer, but it depends.
Yeah, it's there is no one size fits all. I mean, I found out about my genes after I had the withdrawal symptoms, and then I understood why, right? Yeah. So still, there is the question about carbs. I mean, I sometimes, when patients come to me for a fast, I mix methods, and sometimes it gives a good kickstart to stay away for carbs for a certain time when you start fasting. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's very individual. I mean, I think if you have somebody that has been, you know, their diet has been predominantly carbohydrate, sometimes they can really suffer from withdrawal, and I think that needs to be done a lot more gradually. So I might keep the carbohydrates in, but reduce them for a little bit longer. And you know, it's funny, but hormones are involved in this as well. And if if the withdrawal of carbohydrates starts increasing the stress hormone cortisol, then that makes them hold on to their fat. So actually, this is something that, again, you really have to gauge and watch and follow up on, and see how your individual patient is responding to that. And then take it from there. But there are other patients actually who are really up for just getting those insulin levels down, and they're prepared for the hungry periods and the weakness and all of that, and they just want to get to it, and that's fine too. It depends on your vitality and your energy to embrace something. So again, it's something that we pick up when we do our initial consultation with you.
Yeah, and I think there are many questions about insomnia and hormones that you just answered in a way, and I think fasting is part of a regulatory therapy. So the body will take and react as it needs, and the guidance will be there through us, through the therapists, but the body, you can't force the body to do things that it is not supposed to do, right? So it's in this regulation. Obviously it will have an effect on hormones in menopause when you do fast, and obviously it will have an effect on your sleep quality or your pattern of your sleep. Obviously these things are better managed or easier managed in a residential setting, right? But then you need to explain what happens, right? But the regulatory process in the fasting, I think this is very strong. So you can't you can't predict how your lifestyle will change with a fast. There are certain things that are generally to be said, right, that happen biochemically that you explained to us so wonderfully. But how it will affect your hormones and how it will affect your sleep, that depends on many other factors as well. Yeah, and this is why I think that the emotional impact that fasting has on us, right, on this level, is very important, because when you are thrown back to yourself in a meditative fasting, you might not always like what you see, and so you need support and maybe even counseling, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, what you're saying really is that fasting, food actually is about connection. It's about connection to others, but it's also about connection to ourselves.
Yes.
And when we give it up, it's a very, very powerful thing, and that can release so many different emotions, because it's to do with our families, our relationships with our families, our relationships with food, and all sorts of things like that. And so it's something that we hold very, very close to us. And you're absolutely right. Fasting sometimes can feel incredibly liberating, because we're letting go of something that we thought was controlling us. But we've got to be very sensitive to that process. And, you know, we're here to support people when they're going through that as well. I think that probably happens much more when people are doing prolonged fasts and when people are doing residential fasts. Yes. So we maybe don't see those lows quite as much as in an outpatient setting, but obviously it can still happen, and we are here to support people through that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grover, Nikita. It was a pleasure. Thank you. And I think we have to round it up. We have overstretched our time already. So thank you very much. And if you have any more further questions, just don't hesitate to contact us here at Lanserhof at the Arts Club.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much, Nikita and Ursula, for such a fascinating talk around all the myriad long-lasting benefits of fasting. Thank you all for joining us for this evening's webinar. And if you would like to learn about how Dr. Grover and Dr. Levine's work can improve your health, your energy and weight, and empower you to regain control of your health, please do email on medical@lhtac.com to reach the team at Lanserhof at the Arts Club. The team can also follow up with any specific questions you might have that got missed off or there wasn't time for here. So thank you so much all again, and I wish you all a very good night.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Charlie. Bye. Good night.